how long now? Almost 3 months? Since June, 6 months now, with so many different conversations, so many fascinating fields of research. Our last discussion dealt with Dr. Mutobi's work around digital inclusion and financialization across the continent. And today we are changing speed just a little bit. So I would like to introduce our speaker today, who has a really nice to the point bio, which I always love. But if you want me to add anything more, just say the word. I'll just like list off all the achievements in life. But we have Dr. Mary Carman, who's a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Witwatersrand, and her research interests lie in the ethics of artificial intelligence, amongst many other things. She's also the co-chair of the Working Group on Digital Earth Governance and Ethics of the International Society of Digital Earth, as well as an expert member of the Global AI Ethics Institute. She has work published or forthcoming in journals such as Ethics and Information Technology, Patterns, and Big Data and Society. And today, Dr. Carman is going to be presenting, I guess there's a paper, if I'm not mistaken, titled, a presentation, titled Bias Toward Weird People in Explainable AI Research. I've kind of been sitting, I was going through the abstract and I was like, yeah, obviously, but like, tell us, like, what's going on here? So I won't go through the abstract because I think she is perfectly capable of explaining this herself. So I'll hand over to Dr. Carman. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great, thank you for the introduction. Should I turn on my camera briefly?
Yes.
Okay, I'll turn on my camera so I can say hello, but I'm going to turn it off because it's a very low camera, so not very flattering. So thank you first for inviting me to give a talk today. Now I'm going to turn the camera off. Right, so I'm going to be talking about some research that my colleague Uwe Peters and I have been doing, where basically we argue that there's a bias towards weird people in explainable AI research. And yes, it seems like, well, sure, that's obvious, but now let's try and support the basic intuitions we might have about that. By weird here, we're using the acronym which stands for Western and Educated, Industrialized, Rich and Democratic. So we're saying there's a bias towards people coming from those kind of nations in explainable AI research. And actually, just before I really get going, I want to thank Uwe for all the work he's been doing on this. He's really been driving the project. The first author, but I get to present it now. So thank you to him. It's been really great to work with him. Well, I'm trying to move my slides. There we go. Okay, it's working. So a bit of background then. We're looking at the field of explainable AI. And this field has sort of developed in response to, well, challenges and developments in AI more generally, and specifically the way that AI systems have developed, largely through things like machine learning and vast data sets, have developed in such a way that they are opaque. They're very difficult to understand. Even experts and developers themselves don't necessarily understand or can explain how an AI system is coming up with the outputs that it does. And this impacts things like trustworthiness, whether people trust these systems and their outputs. So explainable AI has developed as a field basically to supplement these opaque AI systems with XAI algorithms, which are models specifically developed to make these opaque systems outputs human understandable. So they're seeking to basically explain what's going on, explain how these outputs are being produced and reached. Now, understandability can be influenced by a range of factors. A lot of attention is being paid to how AI experts and lay people have different perceptions of XAI outputs or and sort of explanatory needs there. And what Uwe and I have been interested in as well, could understandability also be impacted by things like cultural background? Our focus is coming within the context of just in general a greater call for more cultural inclusivity in AI research across the board. but also recognizing that other fields have noticed a problem in sort of diverse populations being tested. So in particular, psychology and human-computer interaction have largely acknowledged that there's a problem with an over-reliance on so-called weird sampling in their sort of in their studies using human participants. So again, that weird is Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic sampling. And what we were interested in was, well, could something similar be happening in XAI research? And there's just not actual data out there to be able to say one way or the other. If it's happening, it's a potential problem. If it's not happening, that's great. So we wanted to set out to see what is going on in XAI research. And what I'm going to cover now in this talk then are the three following points, which are basically what we're going to argue. So the first is that there is cultural variation in explanatory needs and preferences, and these variations are directly relevant for current XAI types. So firstly, that there's cultural variation in what people expect in terms of explanations or prefer in terms of explanations. So that itself is important. There might be variations, but it's just not relevant to the kind of work that's going on in XAI field. But we argue that there are variations that are directly relevant. Then the second claim that we're going to argue for is that the research does not seem to be sensitive to the possibility that there are such variations or that there are such variations at all. And to support that, I'm going to present some of the findings of a systematic literature review that we conducted. And then ultimately, we're going to argue that there is a cultural generalization bias in XAI research. And what we mean by that is that there's a tendency to extrapolate study results from weird to non-weird populations when this is not warranted. So it could be warranted, but we hope to show that it's not warranted. So I'll go through each of those briefly in turn. Starting with the claim that there is cultural variation in explanatory needs and preferences, and that variation is directly relevant for XAI types. And basically how we support this is to draw some parallels between popular types of XAI outputs and preferences for explanations or explanatory styles, which seem to vary across cultures. So there's a parallel there, and there's a rough correspondence between types of outputs and preferences for types of explanation, which has cultural variation. Then it looks like there's going to be variation that's relevant. Now, a very popular type of XAI output, I don't know if there's an easier way to say that, are what we can call internalist types of outputs. So these are approaches to explaining an AI system in terms of the AI system's internal representations. So either directly accessing what those internal representations are or making some kind of inference about what those internal representations would be. So an example here is the kind of LIME approach, which stands for Local Interpretable Model Agnostic Explanation. So this kind of XAI approach, you might find an output such as sneeze, headache, no fatigue, so flu. And that's to explain the AI system, the opaque AI system's output of a flu diagnosis. But what you'll notice with something like sneeze, headache, no fatigue, so flu, is that explanation roughly aligns with what a human GP might say. And in many cases, and for many people, we'd also be quite ready to say that that's what the GP believes, right? They're going through a thought process of there's a sneeze, headache, no fatigue, oh, so there's flu. So that's an example of what we're calling an internalist type of XAI output. And this is a very popular approach, different forms, different models, but these kind of talk, they're not actually representing what the AI system's actual processing is. It's making inferences about it. But these types of explanation are, and I've got a quote from Madadi and Barada here, are thought to be analogous to the human way of explaining decisions, where we explain decisions in terms of beliefs, desires, and intentions. So we might explain, why did the GP say that there was flu? Well, because he thought that there was sneeze, a headache, no fatigue, and believed that, well, the best explanation for that is flu, something like that. We also find, and here's another quotation from Zarelli, that a significant body of work in XAI now aims to explain machine learning systems by reducing their operations to a form that is amenable to belief, desire, representation. And in fact, many researchers even hold that these systems should focus on explanations that cite these internal processes or states of people, or states rather, because people expect such explanations of AI, and that's what they claim. But what we want to ask is, well, actually, is this preference for this kind of internal explanation, making reference to internal states of the AI system, is that preference likely to be shared cross-culturally? And there's evidence to suggest that the answer is no. So here I'm going to draw on research done largely in psychology and a distinction that's often made between individualist versus collectivist cultures. It's worth noting that this isn't to say that this is a hard and fast distinction. It's completely gradable. Some cultures will have individualist and collectivist elements. So we're not saying that a culture is this or another culture that. But there is evidence to suggest that there are these broad tendencies, at least, such that it's useful to talk about a distinction between individualist and collectivist. So in individualist cultures, the sort of typical features are things like that the human self is viewed as some kind of discrete entity that's independent of others. And then a person's self-concept might be in terms of internal characteristics, such as character traits, being a kind person, for instance. In contrast, in a sort of broadly collectivist type of culture, you find a tendency where the human self is viewed as interdependent with others, so not independent, so with others and with other individuals. So we got that contrast already between viewing the self as a discrete entity versus viewing it as interdependent. And then you find that there's typically a sort of the self-conception is in terms of social roles, relationships, and expectations. So, if you have a self-concept in terms of internal characteristics, such as character traits, being a kind person, the contrast is with having a self-concept in terms of, say, being a parent, the kind of social role that one might have. And where this becomes important is then the idea that there seems to be a distinction between how people coming from broadly individualistic or broadly collectivist cultures tend to explain human behavior. And again, just to emphasize, we're not saying this always happens and this culture is 100% that. It's all along the spectrum, just looking at general tendencies. So within a sort of individualist cultural context, you find a tendency towards explaining behavior in terms of being a product of an agent's internal states. So those are belief, desire explanations. Why is that person standing there? Well, he believes that if he does, he'll receive something and he wants that. Explanations like that. In contrast, a collectivist type of explanation of behavior is typically in terms of not just internal states, might have a role for internal states, but also viewing behavior as a product of external factors to the agent. So here's some examples of what sort of that kind of collectivist externalist explanation might be in terms of factors that are external to that agent, to that individual. So this is from Henrich et al., a very influential study, saying that people from non-Western populations, and here they the population set included Asian, Australian, Chinese, Malaysian, Filipino, Japanese, Mexican, and Malay. So people from non-Western populations more strongly endorse ideas suggesting that traits do not describe a person as well as roles or duties do, and that trait-related behavior changes from situation to situation. So here, factors external to the individual are coming into how best to explain their behavior. Then Fisk et al. From an earlier study, explanations of behavior within this kind of collectivist setting seem to require an analysis of social roles, obligations, and situational factors. So, you know, an explanation in terms of social roles might be something like, well, he said to wait there. So a social norm of respecting what other people have told you to do is coming into that explanation of, you know, why is that person over there? Versus a more internal explanation in terms of beliefs, desires, you know, she believed it was her turn, things like that. Another example of a kind of external explanation we might give is in terms of traffic rules. Why are you driving on the right-hand side of the road? Because in South Africa, we drive on the right-hand side of the road. That's an explanation of that behavior in terms of social norms, rules, situational factors. So we can broadly classify these kind of individualist style explanations of behavior as internalist explanations in terms of internal states of a person, and these collectivist explanations as externalist explanations because they're drawing on social factors, things external to the agent. And these distinctions and explanations of behavior have been backed up by lots of studies, just to note that. I've got some old references there from 1998 to 1984, but it's a well-supported distinction and difference there. So what we want to draw attention to, though, is how there's a bit of an overlap between nations or countries that score low on a sort of collectivism index, in other words, have higher individualistic sort of cultures, and weird countries, right? And now again, you know, the claim that we're making is that in many cases, not always, internalist explanations favored by those individualist types of cultures explaining human behavior roughly correspond to what would be weird preferences. Whereas externalist explanations in terms of social situational features roughly correspond to non-weird preferences. Of course, this is gradable and there'll be overlaps, but drawing out attention to a general pattern here. So on this slide with the map, based on the global collectivism index, which kind of gives different grades for how collectivist a culture might be. Highly collectivist cultures, we find them in Africa, East Asia, for instance. Low collectivist cultures where you'd have high individualist elements, more Northern Europe, America, Australia. But those are what are typically classified as weird countries, as Klein et al. Classify weird countries. So I think that's...
So, just for, do you mind just resetting the slides, sharing again?
Okay.
Because I think some people are stuck.
Right. Where should I, how do I do that?
So you can go back to your MS Teams.
I think I need to do that.
And then just reshare. So unshare and then just reshare the slides.
Stop presenting. Okay.
Yeah. And then just do it all over again.
I've got to remember how to do that. And now I've got to share the right slide.
Yes,
the right window, that one.
One.
Right, okay. Okay.
Cool. And just in the chat, if they can just indicate if we're
Is that better?
good to go.
Get back to my presenter view. Do you still
Yep.
do you see?
They can see.
The slides on the presenter.
The slides.
You don't always want to see what's
Yeah.
are included. Okay, yeah, I was just saying, so the sort of weird countries that are usually identified are North America, Canada, USA, Northern Europe, Central Europe, UK, Israel sometimes in there, can't see if that's happening on our picture here, Australia, New Zealand. So yeah, the point here is that weird cultures that we can also, or countries that we can classify as weird, tend to score low on a collectivism index, so they tend towards a more individualist sort of culture. And if we have these preferences for explanatory types, we'd say that it looks like there's going to be a preference towards internalist explanations in weird cultures or weird countries. Now, I mentioned earlier that internalist explanations are very popular in XAI, even with some researchers saying this is the way that we ought to be going. But if it's the case that they're testing their systems and their models on populations that are not culturally diverse, and on top of that, populations that are coming from, in particular, weird countries, then it looks like we might be overlooking variations in explanatory preferences. And we have the scope for a bias to enter the picture, and a bias that is potentially problematic. So that's the second part then of what we claim, which is that XAI research does not seem to be sensitive to such variations. Perhaps it's still coming to the conclusion that these are the methods that we should be pursuing. That would be fine. But we conducted a systematic literature review of XAI user studies to try and establish whether there is sensitivity to these cultural variations, and it doesn't look like there are. So we had 4 research questions for the systematic literature review. The first one, what is the cultural background of the samples tested in the user studies? Second question, do the researchers conducting these studies restrict their conclusions to their participants and target population, or do they generalize beyond them? So that's relevant if they are, if they're aware that they're only drawing participants from a particular cultural background. If they're restricting their conclusions to that, that's not a problem. If they're going to make more bigger generalizations, then you need probably need a richer data set, sampling. Our third question, is the scope of the researchers' conclusions related to the cultural diversity of their participants and samples? So again, looking at who's making those generalizations, and is it correlated to greater diversity? And then our last question, do XAI researchers conducting these user studies more generally display awareness of cultural variations in people's AI explanatory needs? I'm going to go very quickly over just details of the process so we can get to some of the results. But we included any study that was surveyed people and their views about XAI outputs, was an article, conference paper, or book chapter, and published or uploaded online between 2012 and 2022. So we did look at papers that weren't necessarily published in journals as well. In the end, we identified 220 papers for inclusion, and then independently extracted information such as what kind of output, XAI output, is being tested, which we classified as internalist, externalist, both of those, or social situational. We extracted information about participants' cultural background, the scope of the conclusions, is it generalized, is it restricted to the study at hand, or restricted to a particular population, and whether there was awareness of cultural variation in XAI perception. And just to note that we did look at inter-rater reliability, and we pretty much were either in substantial or almost perfect agreement. So let's go back to those research questions and what our findings were. So that first question, what is the cultural background of the samples tested in XAI user studies? And the first thing to note, which is pretty significant, is only about half of the papers that we surveyed, that we reviewed, gave cultural background information at all. So only 111 papers out of the 220 gave any kind of cultural information. Of those, 101 or 91% involved predominantly weird samples, and only 10, so 9%, reported studies with predominantly non-weird populations. So what we're finding is that cultural background isn't being noted as something worth reporting on in the first place. And then when it is, we're still finding that there's huge sampling of weird populations here. That's not necessarily a problem. So that leads on to our second question of, if weird populations are largely what's being sampled, are those conclusions being restricted to those populations, or are they being generalized? So our second research question: do the researchers conducting these studies restrict their conclusions to their participants and target population, or do they generalize beyond them? Obviously, we could only look at the 111 papers that included cultural background information. But of those, we found that 71 or 64% of the papers included generalized claims. And by generalized claims, what we're talking about is sort of conclusions in terms of humans, people, users. So 2 examples here. Our findings demonstrate that humans often fail to trust an AI when they should, but also that humans follow an AI when they should not. Or another example, users in general overwhelmingly prefer natural language explanations over simple activity labels. So there's a generalization going on here. Those conclusions are not saying some humans or the humans who took part in our studies. It's making claims about humans or users in general. In contrast, we found that 40, so the remaining 40, 36% did involve restricted claims. So that's saying our users, or even something simple like reporting in past tense. So, maybe users overwhelmingly preferred natural language. There it's sort of restricted to those users who were tested. So it looks like there's a lot of generalization going on. So our next question arises from that. So is the scope of the researchers' conclusions related to the cultural diversity of their participant samples? Because if it is, if you've got very diverse participant samples, then those generalizations begin to be warranted. So if the papers that are making these generalizations also have diverse participant samples, then that's not such a big problem. But it doesn't look like this is what's going on. So, and just to note here, we used countries or regions as a proxy for culture, and I'll mention that again just in terms of our limitations. But what we did was we then looked at the 111 papers to see how many countries or regions they sampled from. And we found that, well, one paper drew a population from up to 19 different countries or regions, but 86 papers mentioned only one nationality, country, or region. But we also saw that those 86 papers constituted 77.4% of the generalized papers. So in other words, the papers making generalized conclusions were only sampling populations from one country or region. Whereas you'd kind of expect that to be the other way around. If you've got these generalized claims, you'd expect there to be greater diversity in terms of where the population's coming from. We did also, and by we I mean Uwe, did also conduct a rank biserial correlation test where we found that there was no statistically significant correlation between the generalized papers and the nationality or region numbers. So the take home here is that there are these generalized conclusions and claims being made, and it doesn't seem to be significantly correlated to a diverse sample group. So our last research question then was, well, could they still be showing some kind of awareness that there might be cultural variations that are relevant here? So do XAI researchers conducting these user studies display awareness of cultural variations in people's AI explanatory needs? And this could be in terms of, in discussing the limitations of their studies or discussing the justifications for their participant choices. And we found that 206 out of 220 papers displayed no awareness that we could identify of potential cultural variation. On top of that, of those 206 papers, 135 of them, 65.5%, had generalized claims, and 14 of the 14 which did have awareness, there was much more having restricted conclusions. Rather, eight of the 14 papers with awareness had restricted conclusions rather than generalized conclusions. So what does this all mean? I mean, what lessons can we draw from this? Well, we think that this shows that there is what can be called a cultural generalization bias, which is a tendency to extrapolate study results from weird to non-weird populations when it is not warranted. Why is that? Well, firstly, most of the user studies that we reviewed did not mention cultural background at all. So actually we can't engage with those papers in terms of are they sampling diverse populations? We don't know. But in the ones that do give cultural background information, we find that non-weird populations seem to be rarely tested in XAI user studies. Yet, in most of the user studies that we reviewed, the results were generalized to people across cultures, people in general, users, humans. But we didn't find that there was a significant correlation between these generalized claims and having a more diverse study sample, which would justify those kind of generalizations. On top of that, to go back to the first part of our paper then, there is evidence of cultural variation in explanatory needs and preferences, and these seem to be directly relevant to current XAI types. So explanations in terms of internal states or processes versus a more externalist explanation in terms of social situatedness, social norms, social rules, things like that. And this means, or it may mean rather, it can be a bit more hesitant here, that the explanatory needs and preferences of non-weird populations who are not being sampled in these user studies are being overlooked in XAI research, which might explain why there is a strong push towards saying internalist explanations are the routes that we should be following. So that's this cultural generalization bias. And then just quickly in closing, I'll finish with just noting some limitations with our literature review in particular, and then some recommendations that we have. So in terms of limitations, we only searched 3 databases, Scopus, Web of Science, and Archive. I don't know how you say that, but we feel that this choice is justified. Scopus and Web of Science have huge representation of relevant fields. Archive is we're able to access grey literature there. That's where a lot of papers are uploaded, papers and studies are uploaded prior to publication. So it's up to date. We also, and this is potentially a big limitation, only included English language publications and papers. So if we're saying where's the cultural variation and we're only looking at English publications, yeah, shoot us in the back. But again, we feel that this choice is justified. Firstly, because English is the sort of language of science, especially in the field of XAI research. But obviously there could be work that's being done that we're just not accessing. But these English language publications and outputs are the influential ones in the field as it currently stands. Also just to note that while these studies are reported in English, they're not necessarily conducted in English. They're not necessarily working with populations who are English speakers. So there still is room for variation there. And then lastly, we used nationality and region as a proxy for culture. And obviously, you know, one country might be very culturally diverse. So I do have some things to say about that, but I'll leave it for Q&A if we need to. What kind of recommendations then for going forward? Well, the first one is just to note that one of the problems we identified was that there's missing information on participants' cultural background. Half the papers just didn't have that information. And this could be addressed by doing things like revising journal reporting requirements, require that authors give information or at least justify why they're not giving information of the participant pool cultural background. The second problem we identified was that there's weird sampling in XAI studies. And there might be very good reasons for this. Where is the research being done? Where's the research funding? All of that. But we also found when we were looking at how users and participants were recruited, there was a huge tendency to use conventional or convenience sampling, such as through university mailing lists. About 44% of the papers we reviewed recruited their participants in that way. And then use things like Amazon Mechanical Turk. Those were the two most popular ways of recruiting participants. And here, if you want to increase diversity, using platforms like mTurk is better than convenience sampling because you are accessing a broader population. You're not just drawing on your students. There are problems with Mechanical Turk as well. It's the people who sign up to that have been found to be predominantly from USA and India. So again, you're not getting a diversity there. Other platforms like Prolific are better than mTurk in that sense. And there's also Lab in the Wild, which is even better in terms of having diverse people signing up. The third problem we identified was that there are a lot of overgeneralizations of study results and overgeneralizations that don't seem to be supported or warranted. And here you can again do things like adopt existing guidelines for reducing overgeneralizations in other fields. So this is a problem, a recognized problem in science more generally. So the XAI doesn't need to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. So again, including reporting requirements aimed at cutting back on overgeneralizations, using things like a checklist with reminders for qualifying conclusions. And that can be something simple like using past tense to report findings rather than the present tense. Or, that is an immediate way to restrict those conclusions to the studies that was conducted. And Uwe's done a lot of work on that himself. And then the fourth recommendation and the fourth problem that we identified was that there's a lack of awareness of potential cultural variation in explanatory needs. And here would just join a body of researchers who call for greater integration of the social sciences with AI and XAI research more generally. So there's a lot of work in psychology on different kinds of explanatory preferences, explanatory practices. So that could be better related and integrated with explanations in XAI research. But can also do things like promote international collaborations so that you have your researchers themselves coming from a more diverse background and have journals with diverse body of reviewers. So those are just some recommendations for what we've identified as what looks like an overgeneralization, cultural overgeneralization bias in XAI research. So I'll end there. I can put up some references on slides. They're 2 pages though, so there's quite a lot.
Perfect. Thanks so much. And much appreciated. I think leaving that up there just for like a couple of minutes might be useful. So we're going to take a series of hands. We'll finish right on time, which is even more perfect. For the next 10 to 15 minutes, seeing how the conversation goes. If we can keep our questions short and crisp so that we can get as many questions as possible, you can put your hand up in the chat. On Teams, if you would like to say your question verbally, or you could put it in the chat. Zibusiso will be able to pick that up for us. But I'll start in the room first and see if there's anyone who has any questions. And in the meantime, I just noted Geshi's hand there, but let's go with Halfdan, and then we'll move from there. Go ahead.
Thanks, Dr. Schwetzer. Just checking that people online can hear me. Yeah.
Listening via Zoom's
Okay. I think the technology. Okay, good. No, thanks for the presentation, Mary. I really enjoyed it. It's an area I know nothing about, so I was just all ears here. I just wanted perhaps to take a few steps back and talk about that whole concept of culture. And you mentioned that many of the papers, I don't recall the number here, but you said many of the papers didn't even mention the cultural background. And of course, I started thinking to myself, but in my research also rarely refer to culture. And I started thinking about that it's perhaps subconsciously, I deliberately don't mention culture because it's so complex and multifaceted and controversial for many people. It's like you're writing a paper on something, but by mentioning culture, you're opening up a whole Pandora's box that can just hijack what you're actually trying to do. Instead, what I think a lot of people would do would be to believe they capture that by including information about gender, about age, about education, employment, and nationality. And it could perhaps even be argued that those measures combined is actually a better proxy of culture than nationality. And you mentioned it in your last slide that one of the limitations of your research is that you reduce culture to purely nationality. And I was just even thinking that the whole idea of reducing that weird to like a binary variable, either you are a weird country or not, that in itself is a simplification. You mentioned also in one of little sentence, you said, well, you acknowledge that you can be more or less weird in the same, you can be more or less industrialized, you can be more or less educated, more or less democratic. All of these components of your weird concept, you can be that as a country to greater or lesser extent. And I did notice some of the countries that were not weird, like for example, the Baltics. I saw like Estonia was classified as something else. So I just, if you could say a little bit more about that concept of culture, which is a premise of your argument and of your paper. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, so just to add on to Hafton's question, you mentioned that a lot of, you mentioned the US and India, participants coming from two very different sort of cultural backgrounds. So can you also maybe talk a little bit to that, how that plays into the data?
Okay.
And if we take one last hand from Geshe,
Sure.
and then we're good to go. Geshe, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, can you hear me?
Do you want to put your sound on? Or I'll just, yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay,
Yes.
cool. Thank you. So Hafton is braver than me. I didn't want to go first because I don't know much about the subject matter either. I hoped others who do might. But thank you. It was really a very enjoyable presentation. Sorry, Rosveta, can you hear me? Sorry, I was just hearing an echo.
Yes, and the echo's off now.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool. So yeah, really exciting. So two questions. Well, first of all, a comment. I really wish Tema White, who's one of our associates, were here, and I'll definitely suggest she perhaps play back this recording and maybe reach out to you in terms of some of the research she's doing using different methods and looking at science and research more broadly. And I say that because it relates to my first question, which is I kept wondering, particularly in the early bits of your research, whether this research I suppose has been done, but whether it also matches what one might find from looking at other research, so not just explainable AI research, because I'm sure these issues of bias in research are well, you didn't use the word bias, but cultural generalization bias in research is a more general phenomenon. And so whether what you're finding in terms of explainable AI is also something true for research more generally, because there's a bit of it that kept coming back to me. Then my second question was in a way picked up a little bit by the comment Hafton made, because I was wondering what constitutes cultural background and what would be adequate to study this issue of weird. And so I missed, unfortunately, the mapping that you showed, but I wondered what you would want to, ideally, what sort of indicators or variables. Would it just be all of the non-WEIRD bits that you'd want to look at, or what would be perhaps adequate indicators, including for people to reflect in their research? So when you say a lot of the research didn't actually indicate cultural background, what would be appropriate things for papers or future research to indicate? I hope that's clear.
Okay, thank you. Quite a lot there, so I hope I address it all. I mean, maybe I'm just thinking about where to start, and maybe I'll leave using countries as a proxy for culture at the end, because that's the hardest to talk about. So I'll start at the end, I guess, then, just in terms of this. Yes, I think this is a more general phenomenon, and how we got into this is largely more from the sort of psychological social science research, where it has been found that psychology, human-computer interaction as two other fields have drawn predominantly weird samples. And that's been identified as a problem with then making claims about humans in general. So what we're not making a brand new sort of identifying a brand new phenomenon, but what we wanted to examine and assess was whether something similar would be happening in this other particular field. And our conclusions there are yes, they are, because as far as we're aware, no one has looked at, what kind of background, cultural background, national background participants are coming from in these user studies. And on top of that, we do want to make the claim that that background is relevant because of explanatory needs and preferences. So sure, this does seem to be part of a more general phenomenon. So coming at it from looking at being familiar with the sort of psychological literature there, I guess why we use country or nation as a proxy for culture does, or at least why we talk about culture in the first place, is largely coming from saying, look, when we look at explanatory practices, these do seem to be different according to these kind of collectivist, individualist sort of indexes. So that would be what we'd be looking at in terms of culture. And that's why we wouldn't only be looking at something like gender. I think gender, I mean, we didn't extract this data when we were doing the review, but nowadays gender is almost always reported as a sort of relevant background to who participants in a study are. Gender, AI expertise, those are two things that come up a lot. So if we're coming at this from thinking that there just seems to be an explanatory difference between these kind of broadly collectivist, broadly individualist kind of cultures, and these are kind of often sort of put in terms of where in the world, what regions, what countries, again, just to reiterate that, it's not hard and fast. That's then why we started thinking of using country and region as a proxy. Also, practically, I guess there just is that difficulty of saying, well, how do we capture culture? How do we report on it? In the papers, the kind of information which was given when it was given tended to include things like countries. So I'm giving answers here which are kind of practical, of like, this is how we got into this, and then this is what we saw, so this is what we did. It's not really a principled answer, because I think that's a really difficult question of how do you actually, what is a culture? How do you capture that? And I didn't say anything about this, but we did take it into account. But countries like America, if that's had that table with let me go back to it, but how many countries are sampled? Where is it? 86 papers sampling just one country, and a vast majority, I can't think of the numbers offhand, but a large number of those one countries were America or other so-called weird countries. Well, those are also potentially very culturally diverse populations within that one country, right? So we did try to look at that a bit as well, looking at diversity indexes, and relatively, America is relatively not diverse compared to a lot of countries in Africa, for instance. But so we did try to tackle that a bit, but it is a really difficult question, which I don't have an answer to, of how do we actually then classify what culture is. What we're interested in And what we'd want to try and capture is just that collectivist, individualist differences in explanation and explanatory preferences, because that's what we think is very relevant to XAI in particular. And maybe what's relevant culturally is going to differ across different fields as well. Was there anything else I just wanted to say there, other than that, very difficult questions? So I hope I've kind of tackled them a bit. The Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is users largely from America and India. Yeah, I mean, if we're making the claim, and I'll go back to my map, that what's relevant for our purposes is to say that there's this difference in preference for internalist versus externalist explanation, which roughly corresponds with how collective or low collective a culture is. Well, then we've got two samples here, coming from America, which is scoring low on a collectivity index, and India, which is scoring fairly high on a collectivity index. Well, in terms of our purposes, sure, that might be actually quite, reasonably diverse, at least to capture those differences. Mechanical Turk has other different problems. Participants are paid. They are notoriously bad at of taking the study seriously. So just compounded that maybe it's not the best platform to use. Prolific Lab in the Wild are seeking to address those kind of challenges. So they might be have a more diverse user set you can draw on, but also are addressing other problems with that as a platform. So I don't know if anyone's got suggestions for how to, what a better proxy for culture would be than nationality or region.
I mean, I haven't seen any other hands in the chat. I think there's a few ways we can tackle it, but we are slowly and quickly running out of time. But Haftan is gesturing to me. Go ahead, Haftan.
Yeah, no, I don't want to hijack because I've already had my chance, but if there's no one else, I was just curious whether, because at least this is a theoretical argument, but I could imagine you could actually document this kind of bias. And I was curious whether it's something you've thought about how to do that. Because if you know something about the sample, whether it would be possible to show the bias in these studies by comparing across different samples. I was just curious whether you've thought about it to give your argument I suppose, an empirical dimension also.
Yeah, if I can just add real quick to that, that there's also the obvious matter, I guess, in my mind of, I mean, why are the papers not coming out of the other countries? So it would be quite interesting to know which countries the papers were coming from and what institutions they were coming from or nationalities of the authors, if we could find that. And then the other broader one is, I mean, it will only happen if this research is being generated in non-weird countries. It's kind of a hard expectation to have someone in America to be like, you should always be aware of what's happening in Ethiopia. It's a tough ask.
No, definitely, and we're aware of that. I mean, just to comment on that first, where are the papers coming from? They're coming from where the money is. Again, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but we did look at what countries are the participants coming from. Yeah, you got America, but you've also got China, and yeah, where the money is coming from, basically. And that is a hard thing to tackle, but that's part of why we would recommend not using convenience sampling, because then you are literally getting your university students to take part in your study. There are these platforms like Mechanical Turk and Prolific, which have an international reach. So that would be a cheaper way of accessing a wider population. Obviously, then you're accessing people who are signing up to take part in studies. There are challenges all the way down. Yeah, so this idea of documenting the kind of bias ourselves, so is that the idea of, taking a user study and doing it with different populations to see what the results, that kind of thing. I think that'll be really interesting. We haven't thought about that, but it would definitely be a way to go. And that, or even just to explore that, see if there are substantial differences. Because also, just to be quite clear, we're not going to make a strongly relativistic claim that you're going to have different explanations for different peoples. There's going to be overlap, but it's just are we overlooking preferences that might be really important, especially if these systems are to be adopted and used, not just by the places which is funding the research, but across the world.
So we are hopefully running out of time, but I do just want to note, because some people in the room might not see, that there were just 2 other comments, not necessarily questions, from the chat. One related from Geshi, where she just made the comment of, it does make one think about, 1, the value of expressing positionality in research, and 2, the importance in who does research and develops algorithms, because it really matters given the likely unconscious biases that kind of come to effect. And then another comment from Tupukiwe, which is probably we also need to understand what cultural aspects have high effect on explainable AI. And this might justify the use of a certain proxy. So we are going to run out of time. We have 2 minutes left. So hopefully we could get in touch with Dr. Carman. I'm sure your details are with the center, so we can hopefully share that with those participants in the room. I do want to hand over and say a big thank you again before I hand over. A big thank you. Tayarisha will always welcome you with open arms and hopefully poach you from other institutions and just come stay here. I'm allowed to say that out loud? No. But I'm going to hand over to our fearless leader, Geshi, who I'm supposed to introduce and then I forget because I'm excited for the presentation, to give us an update on the center. Geshi, hopefully you can hear me and you're good to go.
Yes, I can hear you. Thanks, Rakosofetse. And sorry, my camera seems to refuse to turn on. Oh, maybe it's turned on now. But I hope the network holds up. Thank you so much for really a very interesting presentation, Mary. And I feel like I probably need to read the paper because I missed some bits, which might mean I'm missing important detail. But it's just fascinating from the perspective of somebody who knows very little about it. So I appreciate your time. And as Rakosofetse said, I hope you'll continue engaging with us and this little community we're trying to grow here. So from Tayarisha's side, we also use these sessions just to give brief updates of what's been going on. It's been a whirlwind of a couple of weeks since our last lunchbox, which was much closer than usual since we met just, I think, a couple of weeks ago. So we got to the end of October where we were running the Civic Tech Innovation Forum all month. And for those of you who maybe didn't have an opportunity to attend any of the virtual or live sessions that we had in Johannesburg, please have a look out for them on our website, on the YouTube channel, because there was really some excellent people in town, some excellent presentations and connections made. And so for anybody interested in what's happening in the civic space in terms of using new technologies, new methods, as well as the journalism space, because it was in partnership with JamLab. I'd encourage you to just have a look at that. We've also had a 2-day writers workshop around the project we referred to last time. This is the project on state-society relationships in African digital governance. And that was really exciting as well. So Halfdan, who is here, Nkokame, who's I think not here, were leading that. And so we had 17 authors from around the continent sharing early drafts of the research they're doing on various aspects of the topic. So we really look forward to being able to share more from that. That's our sort of inaugural working papers series that we've initiated. So that was really exciting to hear and be part of. We've got a number of sessions, seminars, and engagements coming up. So on the 17th of November, there's a session on AI and how it relates to economic and fiscal policy. And so that's in partnership with the African Center for Economic Transformation from Ghana. On the 21st of November, we've got Michael Onyango from Kenya visiting with us physically at WITS. And so he'll be sort of giving a seminar on frontier technologies in democracy and governance, but also being available to us at Tayarisha for ongoing conversations about some of the work they're doing in Kenya and his thoughts on the emerging GovTech incubator that we're wanting to work on. So we really welcome you to be part of either the public event or the discussions if you're interested. On the 1st of December, I think we intend to have our next lunchbox session where our other postdoc, Pelelani, will be sharing on the work he's been doing in thinking about GovTech incubators. So we really welcome you. And so all of the dates, I just ran them through, but obviously Zibusiso will always share those and we'll have them on our website. So please do feel free to keep on engaging. We've been very encouraged by people's interest in these lunchboxes, but also willingness to share their research. And so what we're thinking we'll do for 2023 is issue an invitation to see who would like to share their work next year, and we're hoping flexible faculty, student researchers, as well as any other scholars who'd be keen, just so that we can retain this kind of mix we've been able to have so far. But if we get a sense of who's interested and able to share next year, we can maybe also begin to thematize a little bit the series. So we really welcome you to respond when Zibusiso sends that invitation out. We're thinking maybe not to schedule the whole year, but maybe just at least maybe the 3 or 6 months, just so that there's also some openness to emerging things that come up so that we are always able to accommodate people who have interesting things come up. So I think I'll stop there also, Fetsa, not to be too long, but we always think it's useful because we are not co-located and all of that, just to let you know what's happening. Keep an eye out on our website and please always get in touch if you have ideas or if you'd like to know more or engage more with what's happening. Thanks a lot, Chair.
Thanks so much for that. So once again, I want to say thank you so much for everyone for taking their time to attend these lunch boxes. I'm not sure when the next one is. 1st of December. It's usually the first Thursday of every month. And we welcome you to come again, bring your friends, bring your colleagues. We are growing as a community and it's quite wonderful to see. And once again, thank you to Dr. Carman for presenting your work. And please send our regards to your colleague, Uwe, is that how we say it? Uwe, to tell him that he's also very welcome to come to Tayarisha as well. Thank you so much and have a fantastic day, everyone.